Alrighty, hi everyone. Let's get started. Welcome to the Merit Education Rounds. I am Dr. Elif Bilgic, and I'm an education scientist in the Department of Pediatrics and the Merit Center. Now, the Merit Center, or the McMaster Health Education Research, Innovation, and Theory Center, is an education services center in the Faculty of Health Sciences dedicated to advanced health professions education scholarship with a vision to grow a community of scientists and clinicians to advance health professions education through research and applied science. Although today's education rounds is virtual, many of us in this event are connected by the land on which we work. So I take this time to recognize that McMaster University is on the traditional territory shared between the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and the Anishinaabe Nations, which was acknowledged in the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt. That wampum uses the symbolism of a dish to represent the territory, and one spoon to represent that the people are to share the resources of the land and only take what they need. Before leaving the stage to our esteemed guest today, I will provide a brief introduction. The title of today's education round is AI as a Collaborator, Implications for Team Science and Disclosure. And we have Dr. Lauren Maggio as our speaker. Dr. Maggio is a professor and the director of research in the Department of Medical Education at the University of Illinois College of Medicine. She holds a PhD in health professions education from University Medical Center Utrecht and a Master of Library and Information Science from Simmons University. An internationally recognized scholar in health professions education, Dr. Maggio's research bridges information science and medical education with a focus on scholarly communication, including how research is created, disseminated, and utilized in academic medicine. With her expertise in mind, the rounds today will focus on exploring AI as a methodological collaborator that shapes interpretation, decision-making, and scholarly outcomes, often in ways that remain implicit. During the rounds, feel free to use the chat for comments and questions, as I will ask those during the Q&A period. Also, during the Q&A, you can ask questions by using the hand-raising function. So without further ado, please go ahead.
Great. Thank you so much. And thank you, everybody, for being here today. And thank you, Elif, for that kind introduction. So today I'm excited to talk about something that many of us are already doing, some of us are cautiously experimenting with, and others may be uneasy about. And that's the use of AI as a collaborator in our scholarly work. And before I get started, I want to say this talk is not about whether AI is good or bad. It's not about banning it or celebrating it. Instead, it's about how AI is reshaping scholarly collaboration and what that means for authorship, disclosure, and team science. Now, as an editor and author and someone who has the privilege of working closely with trainees and early career researchers, I've seen how AI can complicate what used to feel relatively straightforward. To this point, over the last year, I've increasingly been asked variations on the following three questions. First, what do we mean by AI use? Is it grammar correction? Is it summarization? Is it when ChatGPT drafts the entire manuscript? Second, when and how do we disclose AI use? What is the threshold for disclosing, and what should even be in that disclosure? And third, and perhaps the most complicated, how do we communicate about AI use within our very human research teams, which, as you know, they always have their very own unique dynamics, and they are very human. Now for today, I've decided to organize my talk around these three questions, because one, they keep resurfacing, and two, because I think their answers are interrelated and they build on one another. So if we don't clearly define AI use, disclosure becomes consistent. If disclosure becomes inconsistent, trust can erode. And once trust begins to erode, it becomes fragile and team dynamics become strained and begin to deteriorate. So I'm going to start by defining what we mean by AI use, and I'm going to talk about a few ways to think about that. Then we'll look at the practice of disclosure, so what researchers are actually doing, what journals expect, and where the gaps are. And finally, we'll turn to that relational dimension, how teams navigate these decisions in real time. And at that point, I want to turn it around to be a little bit more of a conversation. So first, defining AI use. Before we jump into defining AI use, I want to acknowledge that this can feel confusing, at least it does for me. This landscape is quickly evolving and the language we use hasn't fully stabilized. I think one of the core challenges is that when people say AI use, they may mean very different things. For some of us, AI use might mean spell check or grammar correction. For others, it might mean large language models like ChatGPT or Gemini drafting paragraphs, synthesizing literature, or proposing arguments. And technically, these are all forms of AI use that we put under one large umbrella. But I think we can agree that these are not equivalent. So when we collapse everything under this one single label of AI use, we obscure some important distinctions. And when distinctions disappear or become blurred, our conversations can become confused, disclosure debates become muddled, and policies can feel inconsistent. So before we talk about team dynamics or how to disclose, we need to talk about the terrain of AI use. And so I want to do some mapping of the idea, not to create rigid definitions or categories, but to sharpen your thinking and to provide you with flexible ways of thinking about AI use. One way I found it helpful to think about AI use is as a spectrum. On one end, we have assistive AI. That's tools that support surface level corrections like spelling, grammar, minor rephrasing. These tools improve clarity, but don't introduce new ideas. Moving along the spectrum, we encounter predictive text and sentence suggestions. These begin to influence phrasing and tone, but the writing remains largely directed by you, the author. Further along is generative AI, large language models that can draft paragraphs, suggest conceptual framing. And beyond that, we have AI-assisted analysis. For example, tools that summarize interview transcripts, cluster codes, or suggest potential themes. And at the very far end of the spectrum is autonomous drafting, where entire sections or manuscripts may be generated with minimal human revision. And as we move left to right, two things happen. First, the ethical stakes increase because AI is playing a larger role in shaping the intellectual content of the work. Second, the role of the human becomes less and less. Now, another way I've attempted to make sense of AI use is to consider AI use, the difference between AI as tool and AI as a cognitive partner. When we talk about AI use in research, we oftentimes describe it as just another tool. And in many ways, that framing makes a lot of sense. As scholars, we've always relied on tools, and those tools have continually evolved to make our work more efficient. For example, most of us now use reference managers, so your EndNote, your RefWorks, rather than doing all those citations by hand. And if you do qualitative research, you might now use NVivo or Deduce as software, instead of sorting color-coded index cards across your dining room table. Those tools change how efficiently we work, but they don't fundamentally think about who's doing the thinking. However, when we bring in tools like generative AI, we move into a new space. And in this way, AI tools don't simply accelerate execution or reduce labor. Instead, it's participating, at least partially, in the thinking process. And if it's beginning to shape thinking, then we've crossed the threshold from tool to cognitive partner. And that threshold is where disclosure conversations really need to begin. So to kick off that disclosure conversation, I want to focus on three things. First, when AI should be disclosed. Second, what disclosure currently looks like in practice. And finally, I'll end with some practical guidance for how researchers can approach disclosure. So let's start with the question, when should AI be disclosed? As I mentioned earlier, AI use doesn't all carry the same weight. For example, when AI is used for relatively low stakes tasks, most journals do not require you to disclose that use. These uses support the presentation of the work, but they don't necessarily shape its intellectual content. The situation changes, however, when AI begins to influence the substance of the scholarship, or I said earlier, it moves into the role of the cognitive collaborator. Let me give you a concrete example from my own work. This fall, I was part of a team conducting a scoping review, And we were looking at the different factors that medical students consider when they choose a residency program. We ended up identifying about 70 relevant papers, and from those, we extracted more than 1,200 individual factors. We had a lot of data. And as you could imagine, that list was pretty unwieldy. Our first instinct was to slog through them manually and trying to group them into categories. But fairly quickly, we realized that this was a great task for an LLM, not necessarily for humans. So we uploaded the list of factors into ChatGPT and asked it to create a few candidate ways of organizing these factors. Importantly, we didn't just take what the AI gave us. Instead, our team met and spent quite a bit of time essentially trying on these different frameworks, asking where they made sense, where they didn't, and how they aligned with the literature and our own interpretations of the data. In the end, we ended up grafting together elements from 2 of the proposed frameworks and adding on several categories through our own open coding. So in that situation, AI wasn't simply acting as a tool that sped up our mechanical task, although it did speed it up greatly. It also helped shape our thinking about the data. So we viewed it as functioning as a cognitive partner. And because of that, we disclosed the use of our tool when we submitted the manuscript. To make this even more concrete, let me briefly show you an AI policy from my journal. So I'm the editor-in-chief of MedEdPORTAL. I'm not going to read the policy line by line, but I want to highlight the key principle in our policy that authors must disclose use of AI tools in the submission form and describe how those tools were used in the manuscript. However, we make an explicit distinction. If AI tools are used for basic clerical tasks, things like grammar correction and spelling, we do not require disclosure. But when AI tools contribute in ways that shape the intellectual work, then disclosure is required. So again, the dividing line is not whether AI was used, it's how it was used and whether it contributed to the intellectual work of the manuscript. You'll also notice another important point in the policy. AI tools can't be listed as authors. Authors must remain fully responsible for the integrity, originality, and accuracy of the work. And this is absolutely not unique to MedEdPORTAL. It closely mirrors the policies adopted by many journals in HBE and beyond. Pretty much any journal that aligns with the International Committee on Medical Journal Editors' recommendations. So now you might be asking, why would I want to disclose? Why would I want to give myself extra work? So to answer that question, first is to support transparency. Disclosure helps readers, reviewers, and editors understand how a manuscript was produced and what tools or approaches were used. That transparency strengthens not only the confidence in your work, but also reinforces the overall integrity of the scholarly record. Second, disclosure supports reproducibility. Now, while research that uses AI cannot be directly replicated, we wouldn't expect to get the same exact answer out. But knowing that AI was used and how it was used helps future scholars understand how the approach was taken, and they can possibly reproduce the overall process. Third, disclosure reinforces human accountability by making that accountability explicit. And finally, disclosure helps prevent ethical breaches. Many journals now have explicit policies about AI use. Failing to disclose when required can violate those policies and may lead to serious consequences, including manuscript rejection during review or even retraction after publication. I want to give you another very recent example from practice. In a recent case at my journal, I had to reject a manuscript at the revision 3 stage. Now, if you've ever made it to revision 3 stage, you know that's pretty far down the pike. You've invested a lot in this manuscript. So at this late stage, we discovered fake references, which we confirmed to be hallucinations generated by AI. What made this particularly tricky was that the citations looked completely plausible. They used recognizable author names. I knew those names. The titles sounded right. They sounded just like things we would use. And at first glance, everything appeared legitimate. But when we tried to verify them, and we do that, as do many journals, we realized that they simply didn't exist, such that the claims now in that article or manuscript were now unsupported. Moreover, the authors had not disclosed the use of AI upon submission. This meant we rejected the manuscript, and honestly, it was painful for everyone involved. I'm sure it was painful for the authors, but it was also difficult for the editorial team and my associate editors, who had invested significant time and effort reviewing those multiple rounds of revisions. So my takeaway for you is this: please be attentive to the policies of the journals you're submitting to, especially their guidance around AI, but really their policies more broadly. Because when problems surface, especially late in the process, the consequences can be significant for everyone involved. So these are a few reasons why you should disclose, but you may also be wondering, how often do people actually do this? When is this showing up in practice? And recent survey data gives us some insights into that question. In one study by Eng and colleagues, roughly 2,000 biomedical researchers who had recently published in PubMed Index journals, over half of them reported using AI at least sometimes when drafting manuscripts. Now, this was published in 2025 and the data collected in 2024, so I'd hazard a guess that the percentage is likely higher now, if not significantly higher. So to me, this suggests that AI use when writing manuscripts is not a fringe behavior. Instead, it's pretty mainstream. In other words, AI is already integrated into many scholars' workflows, essentially sitting beside them at their writing desks. So if AI use is this common, we might reasonably expect disclosure to be equally common, but that's not what we're seeing. When we examine published manuscripts, the picture looks quite different. In a recent analysis examining over 100,000 manuscripts submitted to JAMA Network journals after the launch of their AI policy, only 3.3% included an AI disclosure. Again, that doesn't match with that mainstream use of AI. And it's no different. We see a similar pattern in medical education. In a study I recently conducted with researchers from Western University and Maastricht University, we looked at just over 2,000 papers published over a 6-month period in 24 MedEd journals, and the pattern looks strikingly similar. Very few manuscripts included formal disclosure of AI use. This signals that what we have, what I like to think of, or don't like to think of, but now I think of as a disclosure gap. We have high self-reported use, but very low formal disclosure. And that gap raises an important question of why. To that question, scholars have proposed several reasons. Some authors may perceive a competitive disadvantage in disclosing AI. This has been called the disclosure penalty. And given how competitive publishing can be, particularly in fields like HPE, where rejection rates can be 90% or higher, researchers may worry that the disclosure negatively influences editorial or reviewer perceptions. Now, whether this concern is justified or not, it likely is still shaping behavior. Others may disagree with disclosure requirements or feel uncertain about how journal policy should be interpreted. Some authors may simply be unclear about what counts as disclosure-worthy use. As we discussed earlier, the boundaries between clerical assistance and intellectual contributions are not always obvious. And although journals have become increasingly explicit, some authors may not be aware that AI policies exist. Finally, there may be hierarchical or demographic issues at play. In some cases, trainees may hesitate to disclose AI use to a supervisor, particularly if they're unsure how it will be received. And this fear is not unfounded. A recent study in Nature by Kwan found differences in the way in which PhD students and early career researchers perceive AI use in comparison to those that are more senior. So if you have a research mentor or senior and you might be unsure, you may be reluctant to disclose. I also think this could work both ways. I could imagine a supervisor being reluctant to admit to their trainee that they used AI, or even peer-to-peer. What's important here is that likely the disclosure gap reflects multiple overlapping factors, not just a single explanation. So while the disclosure gap is concerning, there are encouraging efforts across the field to help close it. One of the most important of these efforts is to provide practical guidance on how researchers can disclose AI in a transparent and consistent way. One effort to provide clearer guidance emerged from a conversation among journal editors. Each year at major conferences, the editors-in-chiefs of HPE journals meet, and we meet at the crack of dawn for some reason. We meet to discuss what they are seeing across their journals. What are the emerging issues, submission trends, and challenges? At the AMY conference in August, one topic quickly rose to the surface, and that was AI use in manuscripts. Many of us realized we were encountering AI in submissions, but disclosure was often inconsistent, or in reality, many of us had not seen any disclosures at all. It also became clear that we ourselves were still trying to figure out what good disclosure looks like. So several of us decided to work together to develop some guidance. And the result was this AMY guide, which was published at the bitter end of 2025. And I came together with the editors from Medical Teacher, Perspectives on Medical Education, to create the guide to walk you through the why, when, how of AI disclosure. Now, in my humble opinion, I think this provides a decent framework for thinking about these ideas. That said, it's fairly comprehensive, and like most guidance documents, it can feel quite dense. It's a little bit of a tome. So while I encourage you to check it out, and it is open access, I think some of the most practical advice comes from Lorelei Lingard, who in a recent study proposed a very simple way to think about disclosure. And that's what she calls disclosure basics. The idea is to keep disclosure simple, transparent, and consistent. First, you state how AI was used. Readers should be able to understand what role AI played in the development of the manuscript. And you should be specific. That means naming the tool, describing the task, and indicating where in the manuscript the AI contributed. Second, include a responsibility statement. Be explicit and recognize that you as authors are accountable for the integrity, accuracy, and originality of your work. Fourth, put the disclosure directly in the manuscript rather than only in the submission form. This makes the information visible to readers, reviewers, and editors without them having to hunt for it. And finally, a simple guiding principle: when in doubt, disclose. Let me show you what this can look like in practice. So this is a disclosure statement from a research paper I published in Academic Medicine in 2024 with Tony Artino and my research assistant, Joe Costello. I picked this example because it was the first time I went through the disclosure process. So at this point, we saw it as a bit of an experiment. And it's notable to say that Tony and I are both full professors, and Joe's career doesn't hinge on any publications. So we recognize that we're in a relatively privileged positions to kick the tire on this process with limited risks. What we wanted to see, though, was what disclosing would actually look and feel like in practice. Now, I have to admit, when I submitted this paper, I was really nervous to see if we were going to get some pushback. Was it going to get a quick desk reject? Were we going to get things back from the reviewers? However, the reviewers and editors didn't raise concerns. We didn't hear anything about it, and it was published. However, since the first paper, I haven't necessarily gotten full pushback, but reviewers have raised questions or requested further information about our AI use. They wanted more information about what we were doing and why. And we were able to address those in our revisions. So turning back to the statement itself, you can see that we tried to follow some of the AI basics when we're writing it. First, we explained how we use the AI tool. We were specific about naming it, the task it performed, where in the manuscript or research process it was used. We also noted that the AI-generated output required substantial revisioning and editing to ensure the final text aligned with our voice. That was our way of taking responsibility, putting in our responsibility statement. And finally, we placed it directly in the manuscript, making it visible to readers rather than only in the submission system. For us, for this manuscript, the decision to disclose was really straightforward because we clearly used AI in the process as a cognitive partner versus just a tool. We saw it as helping to shape the writing of this particular section and felt that we wanted to declare it in addition to trying to see what would happen by disclosing it. Now, before moving on, I thought it would only be fair to disclose AI use when giving a talk about disclosure. So in this disclosure, following the disclosure basics, I walk you through those 3 steps. Now, I'll say I don't know of any guidelines for presentations in terms of disclosure, but I would guess they are potentially coming. So I want to shift gears to turn to the issue of team communication. So up until this point, I've been talking a lot about AI disclosure as if it's primarily an individual responsibility, something a single author decides and reports. But in reality, most scholarly work is collaborative, and that's certainly true in HBE. I would say over the course of my career, I've rarely written alone, and certainly not when I'm working on a research paper. Instead, we're typically producing this work in teams, author teams. And these teams may include collaborators across institutions, countries, research traditions, and areas of expertise. Each member may contribute something in different ways, which is incredibly valuable. But it may also mean that they have different expectations about the role of AI in the writing process and research process. And this means that disclosure is rarely or really should be an individual decision. It becomes a team decision, one that requires open communication and shared understanding among collaborators about how the tools are being used and how that should be reported. And this, for me, prompts 2 different types of conversations that authors need to be having. So in a recent commentary that I co-authored with Abby Konopasky in MedEd, we suggested that AI use should prompt 2 kinds of conversations. The first are what we call I conversations. So how did I use AI? What should I disclose? However, we would argue that you should also be having we discussions. So these focus on our collective discussion. So things like, what do we as a team consider acceptable AI use? How should we disclose AI use? And in this paper, we argue that many of the tensions around AI disclosure arise when teams have the I conversations, but never have those important we conversations. And that's a problem because in collaborative scholarship, those we conversations are essential. So why do these we conversations matter? Well, when teams don't explicitly discuss AI use, the norms around it can remain unclear. Everyone may have their own assumption about what counts as acceptable use and what should be disclosed, but those assumptions may not be shared. And as a result, disclosure decisions often get pushed to the very end of the writing process, usually right before submission, when the corresponding author needs to react to the online system, when they're forced to push the yes or no button about whether or not they used AI. And if problems tend to surface there, that's a problem. You're stuck. AI may or may not have been used, and you have to have that conversation. And everybody's tired at that point. When you're about to submit the manuscript, you don't want to have any more conversations. Another thing are power dynamics. This can also shape how decisions unfold. Again, for example, trainees may hesitate to disclose their use of AI tools to supervisors, particularly if they're unsure how it's going to be perceived. At the same time, supervisors or senior authors may discourage disclosure out of concern about how reviewers or editors might interpret it. And when these issues emerge late in the process, that can create a tension with the team and a lot of uncertainty about how to proceed. Okay, so this should say moving towards better AI conversations, but maybe better AI too. So Abby and I, in our commentary, we put forward a few ideas to help with these kinds of conversations. So first, as I've been saying, have the conversation early, have it often at the beginning, the middle, the end of the project. I think it's important. Role modeling matters. So senior scholars, mentors, editors, we can start to normalize transparency by openly disclosing our use. And hopefully when early career researchers see it modeled, it will lower their perceived risk of disclosure. I think journals can also do a better job of clarifying their guidance. Lots of policies exist, but they can be interpreted inconsistently. And they should be clear. If you don't need to disclose clerical assistance, they should help you to understand where the threshold is then for disclosing. And then finally, training. We need training in how to have these conversations, just like we need training in how to have authorship conversations. AI use isn't just technical. And as we've heard here, there's strong opinions and there can be emotions, and we need to be prepared to have those conversations. And in the last minute, I will leave you with this. I do think we're at an inflection point in this practice. For decades, our tools have helped us execute ideas more efficiently. Now our tools can propose them. I don't think this eliminates human authorship, human positionality, and it definitely doesn't remove our responsibility, but it does complicate it and requires us to have conversations and make responsible decisions about its use. So with that, I'm happy to have questions if people want to stick around, but I completely understand it's dinner time. You can also feel free to email me if you have questions or thoughts. I'm more than happy to have a conversation with you.
Thank you so much, Lauren. This was amazing. I will important points. So, Lauren, thank you so much again. This was a lovely sort of discussion. Of course, everyone was engaged, so it was really good. Thank you again for being our speaker, and yeah, thank you everyone for attending. And please also, make sure to wait for our advertisement for the next merit rounds. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great evening. Bye bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.